Our story begins in the Riverlands. Robb Stark has just liberated River Run and captured Jaime Lannister, along with a few of his cousins, thanks to Roose Bolton, who successfully performed a rearguard diversion and stalled Tywin's army. Upon his victory, Robb Stark holds council with his lords and bannermen, telling them of the word he's received of Ridley declaring himself king, securing the Reach, as well as Stannis amassing his own army at Dragonstone. With talks amongst the men on who to bend the knee to leads to no clear conclusion, it is with surprise that great Jon Umber speaks up. He speaks of his little care for Renly and Stannis, stating that there is only one true king he would follow, the king in the north. Other lords soon bend the knee, Karstarks, Boltons, even Theon, who takes to heart the declaration that he is Robb's brother if he was to do so now. The young wolf, Robb Stark, now king, moves south past the Riverlands and into Lannister territory, leaving his cousin Edmure to hold the territory and his uncle the Blackfish to begin raids on Lannister supply lines. Theon would question Robb's blind willingness to marriage, but after discussing the necessity, Robb would then broker a marriage deal between Theon and Alice Karstark. This would unite the second largest house in the north, as well as give Theon claim to the Iron Islands in the name of the Starks. Robb, still wanting to have the initiative, would send his mother Catelyn to speak with both Renly and Stannis to discuss terms for the North's independence. Lastly, Robb would send a letter to the Wall for Jon, telling him of his recent victories and his crowning. He would wish Jon good fortune as well as a second hidden letter. Robb would soon hear word of the Lannisters amassing a new army and make a daring move to take out the army before they can move on them. This move would come to fruition, for Robb, as in the late hours of night, would use his army to smash upon the sleeping Lannisters, causing a decisive defeat, killing thousands. With morning having come, Robb would examine the battlefield and come across a healer. She was beautiful, and with his attention being caught, Robb would assist her in working help on the Lannister soldier. She would express that her name is Jane, and after learning that the man she spoke to was in fact the king in the north, she would correct herself and inform him that her full name was Jane Westerling, a noble house from the Lannisters. After finishing her work, she would leave Robb, yet he would later summon her to his quarters that night, claiming that while she is a healer, she is still of nobility and would be treated as such. She would be given her own sleeping arrangements and would be taken care of, though he did inform her, for the time being, that she would remain a guest of his, as they were still at war. Over the coming weeks, the two would grow close, and eventually Robb would sleep with Jane. With many things going to plan, Robb grew confident in his war. His next plan was to be his most daring. With Robb on the doorsteps of Casterly Rock, he would lure Tywin into the Riverlands and come upon him on two sides, ending them once and for all. Yet Robb's hopes would be dashed. Word would reach him of Edmure having sallied out against the mountain and Tywin's army, forcing them to retreat back to Harrenhal. In a stroke of bad luck, Robb's plans were foiled. When he would return back to Riverrun, at the same time, his mother would also arrive. Robb would learn of Renly's death and how Stannis now marched upon King's Landing. Robb would scold Edmure for his folly, yet he would maintain blame for himself as he failed to speak of his plan with Edmure in the first place. Luckily, Tywin would still be put between a rock and a hard place, as Robb was still up front, and now Stannis was in his rear. Perhaps things could still go his way. However, that would just be the beginning of things to come. Catelyn, having been convinced by Littlefinger, would release Jaime Lannister in hopes to trade him for her daughters. This betrayal would rock Robb to his core. She had given away one of his main pieces of leverage. Word would soon spread of Catelyn's betrayal, and Lord Karstark, drunk on rage and grief after the loss of his son, will kill 3 of the young Lannister boys in the middle of the night. Robb, furious with this continued fracturing of his forces, as well as their betrayals, brought him much rage and prepared to execute Lord Karstark. But Theon, as well as Jane Westerling, would talk him out of it. Robb was now unsure what to do. Tywin was out of reach. His army was pushing itself as they continued to fight in the south. His mother had betrayed him in a moment of grief, and the Karstarks were no longer reliable to keep their cool. Even Roose Bolton would bring word that the number of his forces acted on their own and were defeated by Lannister forces in the Stormlands. Finally, dark news arrived on Robb. The Iron Islands, led by the Greyjoys, had declared independence and had begun raids on the north. With everyone testing his trust in them, Robb broke and closed himself off. Jane Westerling would be his one confidant and comfort. The coming day afterwards, Robb would come to a decision. Robb would send Theon and the Karstarks ahead, through the main roads to secure and stabilize the Riverlands, while he, along with his main force, would go back through the Twins and reach Moat Caitlin, where one of the larger Ironborn forces took up defenses. Along the road back to the twins, Robb would speak to Lords Umber, Manderley, Clover, and Kerwin in private, before announcing to all of his lords and mother that Jane was pregnant and that he would marry her, making her his queen. Upon entering the twins, Robb and Walder would speak of Robb's decision to break their pact, but after offering the phrase a marriage between Edmure and one of Walder's daughters, an agreement would be met and the wedding would be announced. In a fortnight there would be a ceremony, and afterwards war upon the Ironborn. Secretly unbeknownst to Robb, a scheme was afoot, one that would seek to end Robb's rebellion and rise of a new warden in the north. Stannis had lost the Battle of the Blackwater thanks to the Tyrell forces reinforcing Tywin's army and attacking his rear. With Renly dead and Stannis sent back to Dragonstone, the War of Five Kings was drawing to an end. Roose Bolton had begun to conspire with Tywin. Being promised the north, Roose had allied himself with Tywin to destroy a strong contingent of his forces, weakening Robb's army. He then was able to convince Walder Frey into joining their alliance. This would allow the Freys to take control of the Riverlands upon Robb's death. Lastly, with Littlefinger still seemingly under their control, he would take over the Vale in the name of House Lannister. All that was left to do now was to end Robb Stark and his lineage. This would happen at the wedding of Edmure Tully and Rosalind Frey. The stage was set, everything was in reach. Yet wildcard was still in play, one that none yet has seen. For many weeks, if not months now, Arya has traveled from King's Landing to the Riverlands. She had been under the watch of Sandor Clegane the Hound as both her captor and protector. However, with the war raging on, they were kept under close watch by Sir Beric Dondarrion and Thoros of Myr, two esteemed knights that had been tasked with capturing the mountain by Ned Stark before the war broke out. The pair now led a war party of roughly 100 men, known as the Brotherhood Without Banners. Out of respect and loyalty to Ned Stark, Beric chose to help allow a smooth journey for Sandor and Arya, knowing Robb was headed for the twins, taking his company with him. With this development, and the time of the wedding drawing near, Edmure and Rosalind spoke their vows as Beric and company arrived at the twins. Thoros and Sandor both noticed how many of the Bolton troops formed most of the perimeter around the castle, with many of the Stark loyalists within the inner areas of the encampment. Stark troops drank and celebrated with the Freys, while Bolton men seemed to stand on guard. When stopped at the head of the encampment, they questioned on who they were by Bolton troops, but by luck they were approached by a friendly name. Small Jon Umber had been walking the campsite and noticed the host. When he asked who they were, Beric informed him of who he was and the person he brought. Lord Umber quickly ushered them to the castle. The party and the feast had begun to wind down. Edmure and Rosalind were carried away so that they could consummate their marriage. Brandon Tully the Blackfish had also slipped out of the Great Hall to relieve himself. Walder toasted to Robb for the marriage and the announcement of his child. With the party resuming, music began to play. None were the wiser, as the song chosen to play were the Rains of Castamere. That is, all except Catelyn. She alone recognized the omen. She then glanced at Roose, who eyed her down, glancing at his clothes, noticing his chainmail. Rising quickly, she called out to Robb. Suddenly, the great hall burst open before they could be sealed off. The whole room stops in silence as Small Jon Umber leads Sandor, Arya, Beric, and Thoros into the hall. This was a sudden development, but Walder had already given the command. 10 crossbowmen popped out from the rafters and quickly let loose a volley. 4 lesser lords were quickly shot down. Robb took a bolt into his shoulder and lower side, dropping him to the ground. With the sudden arrival of Beric and his company, the Frey and Bolton men were forced to divide themselves in an effort to kill the Starks. Arya watched as she saw Roose Bolton cut her mother's throat in front of her. Yet Catelyn smiled upon her death, seeing her daughter one last time. Great Jon Umber and Small Jon Umber used their strength and size to hoist 2 tables into the air to provide cover as Beric and Thoros ran to grab Robb and Jane. The Hound forces Roose to flee the room as he cuts down 3 of Walder's sons. Arya, noticing that no one was really keeping an eye on her, or even noticing her in a fit of anger, runs along the edge of the room. Drawing needle from her side, Arya runs up to Walder, who notices her too late as she plunged her blade into his heart. Her mother had been taken from her, and her brother might be dead, but she would have her revenge tonight. The Hound called for her. The Frey and Bolton men in the room had been slain, with many of the crossbowmen fleeing upon seeing their lord slain. Thoros and Beric took Robb, while Small Jon Umber guarded Jane. Arya stuck close to Thoros and Beric, with Sandor and Great Jon Umber covering their front and rear. As the group exited the main castle, they were in shock of the sight in which they saw. The Frey army was engaged with Robb forces throughout the encampment. Fires raged as the clashing of steel and iron rang throughout the echoes of men dying and killing each other. Luck was still on their side, though. With the Blackfish having initially left the room before the assassination attempt, he was able to rally a large contingent of Tully and Stark forces to form some resemblance of battle groups. Edmure himself had also fought his way from captivity and begun a counter-assault on the frayed turncoats. With the Brotherhood also being present in the battle, 3 strong contingents were able to maintain resistance long enough for Roose to flee from the keep. With his plans foiled, Roose contemplated his choices and chose to take his army and flee back to the Dreadfort. Catelyn was dead, a number of lords slain. Robb himself was on death's doorstep from his wounds. The Freys would kill thousands of Robb's troops. With them killing each other, he could take his men north and secure a tight grip on the region. Either way, Robb Stark's reign as the King of the North was done. In the heat of battle, Arya was able to release Grey Wind. With the help of the Wolf and the lack of any true battle formations or competency, the Frey army was eventually cut down, with any survivors surrendering. The battle lasted most of the night. Robb's army was roughly 15,000 before the wedding and the previous night. By morning, he had barely 4,000. Theon and the Karstarks had marched ahead with 3,000. The Boltons made up nearly 5,000 themselves, meaning almost another 3,000 were either wounded or killed by the Frey army, which totaled almost the same size as Robb's without the Freys. The saving grace for the Northerners was the battle experience and the fact that Roose was forced to flee or face the wrath of the Hound. Arya reached Robb's tent and saw a great number had gathered. Jaime Westerling, Greatjon Umber, Sandor, Thoros, and Beric. Nearby, the body of Catelyn had been retrieved, and her corpse laid on a bed. Rosalind sat near her, with Edmure standing by. Lords Cerwyn, Manderly, Glover, Umber, and the Blackfish were out securing the surrounding battlegrounds. Much talk was spoken on what to do, and finally it was decided. Thoros would use the blessing of the Fire Kiss on Robb and return him to life with Beric's life force. Many questioned if it would happen or even work, but after the rite was done and Beric passed away, Robb shortly woke from his slumber. Many grieved the losses. Robb and Arya buried the mother that following night. Fortunately for Robb, while they may have survived the night, he realized that Theon, who had been sent to push out Ironborn raiders, would not know of the treachery that transpired. While they would send ravens and riders, it would be much too late. Roose Bolton's bastard son, Ramsay, and a contingent of men would not only secure Moat Catelyn, but would also assassinate Theon and slay Lord Karstark in the process, burning many of the Karstark troops alive in their sleep. Knowing now that Winterfell was now in grave danger of being taken, Robb would have no choice but continue moving north. Robb must save his home and family. He would leave the twins and controlled by Edmure, who he named the new lord of the castle, as well as send the Blackfish back to hold River Run. From there, the Northern Army would march to meet the Boltons and root them out of the North root and stem. His greatest strength now going for him being that Roose Bolton will now surely believe he had died, and with his death, the end of the Stark army. To begin this next chapter, we must go back some ways. Jon Snow has had a turbulent time as part of the Night's Watch, having continued run-ins with his fellow brothers, as well as being targeted by Sir Alliser Thorne in a vindictive and almost deadly way, and lastly coming to terms with the loss of his family, unable to go and aid his brother in his war. However, one day Jon would receive 2 letters from Robb, one describing the war, as well as his crowning as King of the North. Jon wished his brother well, but after his uncle had gone missing, Jon chose to stay and take his vows. Upon taking his vows, Jon would move beyond the wall with Jeor Mormont and his fellow brothers and clash with wildlings, and eventually he would serve under Qhorin Halfhand. Eventually, with Qhorin, he would be captured by the wildlings, and there he would be forced to kill his ally and gain the trust of Mance Rayder, the king beyond the wall. Here, Jon would meet and fall in love with the wildling Ygritte and learn much of Mance's plans, including the Horn of Winter and the army of 100,000. Jon would be given a chance to make it back to his brothers at Castle Black when he is sent south of the wall with a party of wildlings to help attack the castle. Refusing to kill an innocent old man, Jon would turn on his wildling captors. 3 times he would be shot with arrows by his love, Ygritte, as he rode away. Jon would barely survive the arrows, with Ygritte herself believing she had killed him, as he slumped on his horse and his body hanged. Yet Jon Snow would still draw breath long enough for the horse to make its way to Castle Black. There, Jon would be given time to heal, and afterwards inform the Night's Watch and Mance Rayder and his army. In his time of healing, Jon would get word of Lord Commander Mormont's death and the mutiny at Craster's Keep by Sam Tarly. This made Thorne active commander of the castle and by proxy the Watch. Sam would then inform Jon of Stannis' defeat at the Blackwater, including the news of Robb Stark's announcement with child. Finally, after a week of healing, Jon would be put on trial. While many respected Jon, Alliser Thorne and Janos Slynt would railroad Jon's questioning into a mock trial, arresting him for killing the Half-Hand, deserting the Watch, and sleeping with a wildling. These charges would carry great weight to them, as they were all true and Jon admitted to them while attempting to give context and clarity. Yet Thorne and his supporters would not listen, and instead come to the conclusion then and there. Jon would be stripped from the Watch, no longer a member of their brotherhood. He would then be placed in a cell to await execution, in the words of Thorne. The bastard of a traitor, the brother of a traitor, will die a traitor. Before being taken, Jon would give word of advice to Thorne. Send ravens. No matter what comes of him, they will still need help to fight off Mance's army. Luckily for Jon, his execution would have to wait. Mance and his army would arrive. The king beyond the wall would light a fire to announce his arrival. The fire itself would be 2 miles wide and 1 mile deep, a signal to let Westeros know that he had come. War. 3 times Mance launched an attack upon the wall, sending men to climb and others to open the gate. 3 times the defenders repelled the wildling host, shooting them with arrows and large bolts from their ballistae. But soon, with night falling, the 4th wave came. This time the defenders of Castle Black were surprised by the sudden attack from behind. The host Jon had escaped from had come with reinforcements and laid an assault on Castle Black. The fighting below is ferocious. So much so, Alliser Thorne is called down to take command of the battle, leaving Janos in charge of the wall's defenses. Yet this would nearly cost the defenders everything due to his fear of the wildlings and his incompetence in the heat of battle. Edison Tollett would then take charge in his absence of Janos and begin giving commands. Down below, Sam Tarly would watch as his fellow brothers would be killed. This includes his friend Pip and a young lad named Ollie. Fearing for the safety of the girl he loved, Sam would find Gilly on her and hide her away in the food storage room. Upon leaving her there, Sam would take notice of Thorne being wounded in the leg and being carried away to safety. Seeing no other chance of survival, Sam would go to the holding cells and unlock Jon Snow, giving him his sword. After being given his weapon, Jon would come face to face with the shocking sight of former watchman Carl Tanner, the man who spearheaded the mutiny against Lord Commander Mormont. With him were 2 wildlings and Rast. Jon would tell Sam to go unlock Ghost while he fought off the others. Rast would be able to make his way past Jon and go after Sam in hopes to stop him. Jon would kill the wildlings, and after a heated duel and being cut numerous times, Jon would be able to kill Carl Tanner, avenging Jeor Mormont. However, this revelation still angered and worried Jon. The mutineers were helping Mance Raider. Exiting the holding cells, Jon noticed the fires and battle still raging. He would kill a few more wildlings, saving a few of his former brothers, including Gren, slaying a thin chieftain in the process. As for Sam, as he opened the cage for Ghost, he is tackled by Rast, who had finally caught up to him, only for the mutineer to be quickly mauled by Ghost. By this point, Mance sends for his giants to open the gate at the base of the wall. Seeing the great threat, Gren volunteered with a number of brothers to hold the gate. They were not going to make it through tonight. By now, the battle in the castle had turned in favor for the Watch, with most of the wildlings being killed in the fight. Jon, stopping to catch his breath, notices Janos Slynt running off to hide from the battle. The disgust on his face doesn't last long, though. Jon turns to see Ygritte, with her bow trained on him. Jon only smiles as he gazes at her, though. Her face shows her conflict, as she's angry by his betrayal, yet still sees the man that she loves standing before her. Jon ignores her threat and walks up to her, embracing her in a hug. This startles her, and in a moment of confusion and weakness, drops her bow and hugs him back. Jon simply tells her that he missed her, and to not fight, as he has Sam and Edison take her to the cells. Jon then walks over and knocks out a tired Tormund, allowing his brothers to take him as a prisoner as well. As morning came, Jon fully was taking command, ordering the defenders to restock the defenses on top of the wall, as well as prepare to seal the gate permanently. Looking over, he sees 2 brothers carrying the broken yet alive body of Gren out of the tunnel. Jon had lost many friends in the fight, and now prepared for the next coming assault. Stepping out from the gate, Jon prepared to make a great sacrifice for his brothers, as he went to speak with Mance, either convince him to turn back and sue for peace, or kill him if he doesn't. Yet that would not come, as war horns would blow. On 2 separate flanks in the east, 1,000 armored cavalry begin smashing through the wildling encampment. Their banners are that of the burning stag. Jon realizes what is happening. Stannis Baratheon had come. Swiftly routing the army, Mance surrendered, not wanting his people to be killed in panic. Stannis meets with Jon and takes Mance prisoner. Little good would still come from this relief for Jon. With the battle over, Thorin would arrest Jon Snow once more, this time including other members such as Sam, Edison, and the greatly wounded Grin. Sam would argue that Maester Aemon would not allow this, but Thorin would explain that Aemon passed during the night. Mock trials would be put on the captive brothers, and each would be found guilty of treason for releasing Jon, taking command from fellow brothers, and sparing wildlings in the midst of battle. All of them, including the wildlings, would be sentenced to death by hanging the next day, while Mance Rayder would be killed that night in a death by fire. Before the time of execution, Stannis would meet Jon in his cell, telling him of the Red Wedding and the fact that the Boltons now have claimed the North. Stannis would then ask Jon that if given the chance, would he swear loyalty to him and join him in avenging the North. Jon said he would, but since they were all about to die, it meant little. Stannis would only smile and tell him that he would take care of that. Jon would then tell Stannis that he'd only go if the others came with him. Stannis, questioning this, would ask if the wildlings would follow him. Jon tells him no, but says they might follow Tormund. Stannis would then leave the cells congratulating Tormund on his new command as leader of the wildlings. The following morning, as the sunrise crept over the horizon, Thorin is shocked to see his prisoners being loaded into a carriage. Past the burnt pyre, Mance was placed on. Thorin would threaten them in a fit of anger, and this would cause Stannis to draw his blade as well as his men, who at this point, with just a token force, still tripled the number of Night's Watchmen present. Thorin would back off, but Janos would make an insulting comment on Jon and Ygritte, mentioning his brother, before snarking a comment back at Stannis. Stannis would then have his men grab Janos and force him to kneel before giving Jon his sword. The man who gives the sentence should swing the sword. Jon then beheads Janos there in front of everyone. Stannis then declares that he's taking the prisoners south to face justice for treason and now the murder of Janos Slant. Any attack on him is an attack on the crown and will face the king's justice by fire. Stannis then sallied out with his host, regrouping with his army and family. Stannis would send Tormund, Jon, and Ygritte with Davos to bring whatever wildlings would follow to sail south of the wall from Hardhome to White Harbor, where they would meet back with him and his army. Stannis' plan was then to march on the Dreadfort and take the Bolton's castle and raze it to the ground before moving on to Winterfell. Jon felt odd. He had lost so many brothers in the battle. He had lost his mentor in Gior. As far as he knew, his brothers of Bran, Rickon, and now Robb were probably all dead. He had a heavy heart with these feelings, yet when he would look back at Ygritte, he would feel his heart warm up. There she sat next to him in a similar situation and life experience as Jon. She looked back at him, giving him an assuring smile. She may have not fully forgiven Jon for betraying the wildlings, but he was here now doing what he can to save them and get them south of the wall, having also saved her from death by Thorn as well. Whatever it is she thought of him, it was overruled by the love she had for him. Jon sat back looking at the hilt of his sword, remembering the words Robb spoke to him. Next time I see you, you'll be all dressed in black. It had been nearly 3 weeks since the Red Wedding. Roose Bolton had secured his grip on the North, having claimed Winterfell for his own. Being smart and acting fast, Roose would secure the Karstark loyalty by betrothing Alice to his bastard Ramsay. A number of lesser lords would be forced to submit to the new warden's rule as well. Lord Cerwyn would initially refuse to submit and be publicly executed. This would cause his son to bend the knee soon afterwards. The Manderleys, who have always been Stark loyalists, would submit as well, but would not send any troops to support him, claiming they had lost nearly all their men fighting in Robb's war. House Glover would soon also submit to the Boltons after hearing of their fellow Betterman smithing. However, hope still burned in the north. House Mormont on their island refused, claiming they know no king in the north except for a Stark. As well, at this point, Stannis Baratheon and his army had touched down the north, mustering at Eastwatch by the sea. He had apparently repelled a wildling army and now prepared to march on the Boltons for their treachery. Lastly, no word had come from the fray since the Red Wedding, and the Tullys still were in open rebellion. Perhaps they still held out hope for Stannis would be their savior. Either way, Roose knew that it would be some time before the Lannisters would send reinforcements, especially with the supposed death of Joffrey and Tywin. So Roose would do the one thing he could think of, and he would form an alliance with the new Lord of the Vale, Littlefinger. By this point, Roose's wife had birthed him a son, so he decided that when the boy becomes of age, he would be promised to one of Lord Aaron's children after he marries Littlefinger's supposed daughter, who at this point was still secretly Sansa Stark, whom he had been able to rescue and sneak away from the Lannisters after Joffrey's death, freeing her of captivity. With the Vale now backing Roose and being untouched, the stage was set for the Boltons and the Baratheons to have their war. Yet, another set of whispers still kept Roose up at night. Were the wolves howling in the woods, baggage caravans being raided, men being killed in their sleep. Word of a ghost of Robb Stark, a knight in armor with a helmet shaped like a wolf, scouring the wilderness, killing all who support the Boltons. Men being strung up or beheaded, torn apart by a raging animal. The supposed ghost was a haunting for the Boltons with only a single message left behind. The North remembers. Focusing back on Robb, he knew he did not quite have the strength to challenge Roose head-on, and with many of the lords either now dead or having submitted to the Boltons, all he could do now was continue his raids. With both Edmure and the Blackfish holding the Riverlands from the attack on the south, another chunk of his force was taken away. With limited resources, Robb would send many of his supporters back to their keeps and holds. There they would do what they can to supplement the Boltons' supplies and resources. Robb would even send small Jon Umber and their forces back to make peace with Roose and meet with Stannis on his behalf. Lastly, Robb would still be watching over Arya, and now with a token force of 1,000, would split into 10 encampments surrounding Winterfell and the forests. From there, they would have eyes and ears on all that transpired. It would be around this time Robb would learn of Littlefinger and the Vale, their supposed alliance with the Boltons. Wishing to learn of what had become of his brothers, Robb would find his chance with the coming of Brienne of Tarth and her squire Podrick, both of whom had been sent by Jaime Lannister to find and protect Sansa. When Robb questioned him why Jaime would have done that, Brienne would speak of her time with him and how Jaime protected her from Bolton men and so forth. Robb would discuss the matter with his council and tell Brienne that if Sansa was indeed somewhere in the north, then she would be given her chance to do her duty on one condition. Brienne would be sent into Winterfell under the guise of a sellsword, and there she would learn what had become of his brothers. Then she would return to him with the information. Until then, Podrick would stay with Robb as insurance. Brienne would accept those terms and infiltrate Winterfell, offering her service to Roose Bolton with her claims of wanting revenge on Stannis for the assassination of Renly. To gain more favor, she would even inform Roose of her charge to find Sansa Stark. The news of Sansa Stark being somewhere in the north or the Vale would cause Roose to begin mustering his men. If he could catch Sansa, then he would be able to hold the key to securing the north in its entirety. Brienne would then be able to learn what had become of the other Stark boys. Bran had disappeared fleeing north with the help of 2 young companions. As for Rickon, they were able to capture him fleeing for House Umber with a wildling woman. She had been killed after her captivity. As for the boy, he was currently being held in the Dreadfort. With her new information she was able to gather, she secretly was able to send word to Podrick of the Boltons and their plans. Yet Brienne's chance to prove herself from the Boltons would come when Roose received word that Stannis was on the march from Eastwatch, and his first target would be the Dreadfort. What was even more damaging was the news that Stannis was supposedly recruiting wildlings to reinforce his army, promising them land for their service. Roose was able to uncover this information from his spy on the Night's Watch, Locke. Roose would inform Ramsay to hold Winterfell. He would personally take 3,000 men to attack Stannis in the rear, while he laid siege to the castle. Ramsay would keep the other 3,000 and begin pulling in reinforcements from the houses that submitted fealty to them. Roose would also tell Ramsay to recruit the Night's Watch, claiming a wildling invasion was underway thanks to Stannis, and if they aided in the fight, then Roose would reinforce the Watch with recruits, food, and money. As Roose amassed his forces, Brienne felt conflicted on what she should do. As she looked deep into herself, she decided that Renly's murder could no longer go unpunished any longer. She would give Robb the news of Stannis, but would leave Podrick and the others behind as she set out with Roose to face Stannis. Robb, now with all the information he needed, would see it's time to make his move. Robb would send Arya, the Hound, and Podrick to go east. Young Lord Arryn was still their cousin, and if they could get their support over Roose, then they would have an army large enough to take Winterfell back. Robb would have 100 men go with them, and inform them to make haste. Robb would then send Thoros with another 100 men to go south and inform Edmure to bring his men north to Winterfell. They were going to make their move. Lastly, Robb would take his last 800 men and force march their way to the Dreadfort, and there they would meet Roose on the battlefield and pin him between Stannis and himself. Before Thoros left, Robb would also tell Thoros to give Jane his love, and that soon they would be safe in the north. All armies marched for their final fates. The Battle of the North was underway. Elsewhere, unbeknownst to the rest of the realm, a slumbering dragon had finally been awoken. Daenerys Targaryen had set sail from Meereen with both an army of Unsullied and a Dothraki horde, with 3 large dragons as well. At the same time in the south, Jaime Lannister had begun to muster the Lannister army, supplementing it with the Tarly army. The War of the Five Kings was far from over. Stannis Baratheon had spent the better part of his life fighting wars. He had fought in Robert's Rebellion, holding Storm's End from the Tyrells, never surrendering. He had fought and defeated the Ironborn when they rebelled against his brother. Now he fights to save a kingdom from the Lannisters, who killed his brother and stole his throne, a throne that was his by right. For a moment when he was blinded with anger and resentment after his defeat at the Blackwater, but his right hand Davos Seaworth had convinced him to do what he now sees was the right decision. He had come north first to save the Wall and the Night's Watch from a wildling invasion, then as a just ruler offered the wildlings peace. If they bent the knee to his rule and fought with him, then he would give them lands. He had rescued the bastard of Ned Stark, the first man to show loyalty to Stannis in his claim. With Lord Snow's assistance, he was able to broker the peace with said wildlings. Robb Stark was presumed dead, the North leaderless, with Bolton traitors claiming lordship after committing a massacre at a wedding. The Northern Lords knew who Stannis was. They had rebelled against the crown when it belonged to the Lannisters, but when he kills the Boltons and dispatches his justice, they will bend the knee willingly. Horns blew as Stannis looked over the horizon, seeing the Dreadfort come into view. Davos would point out that the enemy had been busy building its defenses. As for Stannis, he would give the command to begin surrounding the castle, cutting them off from any attempt to flee or send messengers, as well as to shoot down any raven they see. He would then ask the Red Lady if she saw his death in the flames. She would respond that her vision is clouded, and that his fate resides in the hands of someone not allied with the Boltons. Stannis would take this as a good omen, finally ordering the bulk of his force to set up and face the west. If his plan would work, Roose Bolton would come to him. Dawn came, and Stannis stood out from his tent on a small mound looking over his army. He mustered a force of nearly 2,500 with an additional 1,000 of Northerners, having come to join Stannis after word of his arrival. Stannis spoke. "The Iron Throne is mine by right. The Lannisters murdered my brother and usurped the throne for their own, and now a bastard of incest claims himself king. They murdered Ned Stark, Warden of the North. They had the Boltons betray and kill your king Robb Stark at the Red Wedding. I have come now to free your lands of these traitors once and for all, and rip them root and stem. Hold fast and follow my commands, and I swear that after today, you'll have your peace. To victory or death." Horns would blow, and the sounds of war drums would be heard. Coming over the west hills, Roose Bolton and his army had come. The stage was set for the Battle of Ice. The ground was covered with but a few inches of snow. Stannis had moved his army to the west of the Dreadfort to face Roose Bolton and his relief army. Arrows flew through the sky, raining down on the field of battle. The iron tips of the arrowheads pricked and pierced shields and armor. The first stage of the battle had begun. Roose had aligned men into 2 battle lines, the first being his heavy cavalry, the second was his heavy infantry. On both flanks he attached a contingent of light infantrymen and horsemen. Sprawled just a few yards ahead of his formation, his longbowmen let loose their arrows onto Stannis' forces. As for Roose, he stayed near the second line on a small mound with his personal guard and Brienne of Tarth. 5 volleys had been sent out, and many arrows had met their mark, landing on Stannis' front lines. Dozens fell under the hail. Roose would turn his head to Brienne and speak. "The stag seems to wish to see his brothers. We should oblige him." With a signal from his hand, the large host of heavily armed cavalry began to muster. They started off slow, moving across the field. Popping his head out, Stannis showed himself to be near the front lines, his men having formed a shell with their shields above his head. Most of his army consisted of infantry, it seemed. They looked on at the oncoming horde. The horses under the commands of their riders began to gallop faster and faster as they grew closer. Brienne watched closely, and something seemed off to her. Looking at the field, she asked Roose a question. Where was his cavalry and archers? Roose scanned the field and knew something was off, but it was too late. The opening move had been cast and now needed to play out. Stannis smiled as he saw hundreds of cavalry and horsemen speeding right for him. He counted in his head as they had gone into full charge. Then, with a sudden urgency, he cried out, "Now!" Stannis' men suddenly drew out from the snow long pikes and halberds. The sudden spiked wall appearing caught the Bolton cavalry by complete surprise as they crashed into the spear wall. A few dozen were able to smash into the enemy, but many horses found themselves skewered and stabbed, as those in the back pushed those in the front into the spears. Yet this was not all Stannis had prepared. With the Bolton cavalry halting, most of the Baratheon men knelt down to reveal the center mass of Stannis' army had been his archers. Crossbow bolts and arrows let loose from just a few yards away, ramming into the Bolton host. Seeing his men stop in their tracks, Roose angrily cursed. As for Stannis, he armed himself with a Betrayal and hammered away at the plate armor of the enemy in front of him, using the hooked spike to tear men from their horses. Roose gave the command, and his flanking units began to march. He would win this day. He knew he would. Many of the Bolton heavy cavalry began to break en route, yet as they did once more, while in the heat of battle, arrows began to rain down upon Stannis and his men. Still fighting, they had no time or warning to cover themselves with their shields, and many of Stannis' men began to fall and die along with the Bolton cavalry. Corpses mounted as they piled into one another. One of Stannis' bannermen grabbed their king, pulling him from the hail as he covered him with his shield. Safe from the bombardment, Stannis examines the field, noticing the flanking forces. Brienne herself had rushed out over to the right flank to join in on one of the cavalry charges. Too many arrows fell upon the front lines for Stannis to prepare a proper defense line on the flanks. Brienne and her horses crashed into the right flank, smashing into the Baratheon lines, clearing the way for the light infantry to pile in. While the left flank was able to hold the lines and brace, the right flank turned into a mosh pit of blood and steel. Seeing the turning tide, Roose gave the rest of his men the command. His second battle line began marching forward with him and his bodyguard in the center. Stannis, losing grip on his Betrayal, drew his blade, cutting down 2 different Bolton men as if carving a cake. Seeing their king with them in the thick of battle brought great morale to Stannis' army. They had nearly slain all of the initial first wave, taking moderate casualties. Yet with the chaotic right flank, he worried. Taking a glance and seeing the left hold without much issue, the third phase of the battle was beginning. Stannis eyed Roose and his oncoming army. Nearly 1,500 heavily armed infantrymen marched forth. This would be the true test of Stannis and his men. He would look to the sky. Stannis wasn't much a man of faith, yet he had seen the power of the Red Lady, and with the reminder of Renly and the Peach, Stannis marched forward. His center forces, seeing their king, chanted, "To the king! To the king!" The remaining frontline force and his center reserves of his army archers charged, numbering around 700 men. The Bolton host may have been heavily armed with plates and chainmail, but Stannis, with most of his men, charged with hammers, pikes, short swords, and daggers, counters for the Bolton armor. Stannis himself would see a horse without a rider and mount it. As he led the charge, Brienne, still on her horse, would see Stannis across the battlefield, and with a blind sense of rage and duty, would ride out towards him. Roose, seeing the desperate charge, would draw his sword to signal his men to go into full charge to meet Stannis. It started with the flanks moving first as they wished to encircle him, yet something would catch Roose's ear, a blowing horn. He would look across the field, but not see where it came from, until he suddenly realized it came from behind. Then he heard it, a sentence, a chant. It started as what seemed to be a whisper, but then soon began to echo louder than any of the men dying. "The king in the north! The king in the north!" Hundreds of cavalrymen came rolling over from the hills, bannered with the sigil of a dire wolf. Grey Wind, the wolf, companion of Robb, armored with leather and plates. Robb himself, sword in hand, next to him riding. Roose called his men to turn about, but it was too late. Robb Stark and his host of northern men crashed into the rear of Roose's army. Steel clanged against steel, fists smashed against flesh, hooves kicked against plates and bones. A dire wolf ripped limbs from bodies. Screams cried out as death became the loudest sound in the battlefield. Roose killed 3 men before looking at the mess in the field that was his army. They were surrounded and slaughtered. He had lost, so he needed to flee back to Winterfell. Calling out for his bodyguard to follow, Roose turned to suddenly see the sharp razor fangs of Grey Wind as the dire wolf leapt from the ground. Grey Wind ripped into his arms and shoulders, dragging him across the field as he cried out in agony and terror of the beast that had mauled him. His personal guard fled in fear, seeing their lord be ripped apart. Suddenly it was over, and Grey Wind let go of his prey. Roose, dazed, torn, and barely coherent, knelt, looking up at the pale horse in front of him. The words echoed in his mind. The North remembers. Robb Stark on his horse began to trample Roose Bolton, stomping him to death under the heavy hooves. Robb then looked around for Stannis as the battle was coming to a close. Stannis cut down foe after foe. He then ducked his head as he saw the gleaming of steel flash in his face. Brienne narrowly missed her mark. The two stared off at one another. Stannis was more shocked at the sight of a giant woman in front of him, yet Brienne charged once more towards him. The two swung their swords at each other as they rode past one another, smacking their blades from each other's plated chests, sending them both from their mounts. They both quickly rose up to face off once more in their duel. Their swings and flourishing caused many around them to spread out, not wishing to be struck by a wild swing. Back and forth they went, evenly matched, slipping through the blood-soaked mud and snow. Brienne swung overhead, slamming down Stannis' blade, knocking it from his hand. She charged forth, attempting to end the fight, yet Stannis drew his dagger, dodging the swing and stabbing her hand, causing her to drop the blade. He followed with a knee to her face, knocking her back down. They both slowed greatly, with Stannis stopping to catch his breath, noticing at some point in the fight he had been cut in his leg. As he approached Brienne to finish the fight, he drew his dagger upward for the finishing blow, only for Brienne to spring back up, having found a spear on the ground, driving into Stannis' hip. As Stannis coughed blood, he was thrown onto his back by Brienne. She had done it. She had won. Brienne picked up her Valyrian steel sword, Oathkeeper, and walked over to Stannis, who lay on the ground staring up in the sky, his thoughts on his brother Renly. I, Brienne of Tarth, charge you with the murder of Renly Baratheon and sentence you to death. Stannis merely looked up at her, unable to feel his legs. Go on. Do your duty. As Brienne raised her blade, a strong sense of closure came over her. And then, nothing. She felt nothing. For her, the world suddenly went black into nothing, into a void. Stannis looked on, seeing a portion of Brienne's head fall in front of him, before the rest of her body fell afterwards. A rider had come and circled around Stannis. In his strained breaths, he finally got a clarity in his vision. Robb Stark had dismounted from his horse and stood next to him. The battle was won. The left flank had fully repelled the Bolton attack, and without Brienne, the right flank completely failed to break Stannis' men. Lastly, with the arrival of Robb and his forces, they routed Roose's army, killing them by the thousands. Robb attempted to help Stannis, but the king refused. He knew his time was coming. Shireen, Stannis spoke. Protect Shireen. Robb nodded, agreeing he would. Like she's your own. I will. I give you my word. Your brother. Robb thought he was now speaking of Rickon in the castle, until Stannis continued. Snow. I sent him to take back Winterfell. Robb was shocked to hear the news of Jon. He looked down at Stannis, who lay still. He had now passed in Robb's arms. One of Stannis' men called out, The king is dead! Before another cried out, Long live the king! Then as Robb stood up, all the men chanted, Long live the king! The king in the north! The king in the north! Jon, atop his horse, stared at Winterfell. A castle that he once called home was now some foreign place to him. It's so massive, Ygritte spoke aloud, catching his attention, giving her a smile. They're coming, Davos commented. Jon turned back towards the castle. Marching out from the gates was Ramsay Bolton and his army, or at least the main bulk of it, leaving a force of around 200 to man the castle defenses. Ramsay, knowing of his father and Stannis, and how evenly matched they would be, he would not dare risk a siege if perhaps Stannis won the battle. For him, the smart thing would be to stamp out Jon Snow and his forces of wildlings now. Perhaps they mean to parley, Tormund joked, seeing Ramsay and the host of lords riding ahead of the army. Perhaps we can use this to our advantage. There may not be a need for a battle. You think he'll accept the challenge? Ed then inquired. Only one way to find out, Jon commented. The group of 8 met in the middle of the field. The weather seemed to have favored the day for battle, as a little snow plotted the area, leaving mainly the dead grass and dirt. Jon frowned as he saw Ramsay's entourage. There was small Jon Umber, recognized by Jon for his armor, Alistair Thorne having been summoned south by Ramsay, and lastly a man he did not know, but wore the coat of arms of the Boltons. As for Jon, it was him, Davos, Tormund, and Ygritte. Ramsay looked past them to see around some 3,000 wildlings standing in a mass. On each flank of them, Baratheon cavalry. The two groups spoke to one another, mainly insults being thrown, but then finally Jon offered Ramsay a chance to settle things in a one-on-one duel. Whichever side won, the other would surrender without question. Ramsay refused, noting that with help of the Night's Watch and the Northern Lords, his army doubled that of Jon's. They were armored and had all the advantages. Jon remarked on how well that control holds with the fear, as well as how willing they would die for him if he would not do the same. This angered Ramsay, but he kept his cool. They would fight this day and be done with it. Ramsay declared that no quarter was to be given for anyone on Jon's side. No prisoners, only steel. Jon huffed before turning his back on Ramsay, finally saying, "Remember, you were offered peace and turned it down." As Jon began to ride, Lord Umber spoke. "Lord Snow, the North remembers." This shook Jon as he watched Ramsay and his group ride back to their battle lines. "So what will it be?" Ed asked, seeing his friend return. Jon simply started one word: war. Ygritte nodded her head as Jon looked at her. She quickly rode off to the left of the army, with a number of others in the back of the line shifting as well. Jon then looked at Davos and Ed, who each began riding to a different contingent of cavalry. As for Jon, he and Tormund each took command of a bulk of mass they had mustered. Ramsay looked to his bannerman, Locke, giving him a nod. With the command, Locke rode out to lead his force of heavy cavalry. The plan was simple. Much like how Stannis had routed the wildlings beyond the wall, they would use their horses to rip right into their lines. Thorne would then lead part of the infantry to clean up the rest. As the cavalry marched, Jon and his forces moved up, forming a thick battle line ahead of Tormund's position. Ramsay would give a wave of his hand and arrows would fly, soaring high above and passing their cavalry as it landed down upon Jon's position, hoping to soften up he and his men. Men died by the dozens, but Jon still stand. The ground rumbled under the stampede of horses charging them, yet Jon did not waver. Seeing the force get closer, he finally noticed the passing marker on the ground he secretly positioned. "Now!" he screamed, with one of his men blowing a horn. Hearing the horn blow, Ygritte, who had been at this point secretly repositioned herself adjacent to the battlefield with her force, gave a command. There's roughly 200 archers just over a hillside. They let loose their arrows, raining down on the unrelenting cavalry. They had begun raising their shields overhead to protect themselves. Even their speed had begun to decrease, yet they still charged onward, thanks to Locke's command. If they could reach Jon, then the arrows would stop. Jon, seeing them still coming, gave his hornblower another command. With the second blowing, many of Jon's forces broke forward from their positions, spears and javelins in hand. They chucked their weapons into the air, ripping apart the first few lines of horses. The ensuing chaos caused an uproar in Locke's forces. Horses panicked as they smashed into each other, and men flung from their steeds. Jon gave his third command, and with the third blowing of the horn, he and his forces charged forward, full tilt into Locke's men. Panicked, Locke would be able to get some form of counter-charge off against the wildlings, but it was still more than a stalemate. Ygritte, hearing the horns, halted her men from firing, for now they would have to listen. Horses cried out. Steel, iron, flesh, and blood made a symphony of death as the battlefield became littered and mounted with corpses. Angered, Ramsay would give the command to his archers. They began letting loose volley after volley into the mass. Seeing the cold-blooded nature of Ramsay, Davos drew his sword. Jon, in the thick of the fight, cut down 3 men, looking to see Locke riding right for him. Locke was attempting to end the battle now. Yet luck would not be on his side as Jon sidestepped his foe, cutting him down from his horse. Arrows fell all around. He used Locke's body as a shield to protect him, until finally the arrows stopped. Jon glanced to see Thorne now marching with the Bolton infantry towards them. Seeing his forces growing thin, Jon found his hornblower dead next to him. Without thinking, he picked up the horn and blew it. Tormund drew his sword. "Protect your lord!" he cried out, leading his force out to the battlefield. Davos and Ed also began to ride out to flank their forces. In the center, Thorne and his men charged in full tilt, as Jon and his men were relieved by a countercharge of Tormund and his reinforcements. With the two sides clashing, proper battle lines began to form, with the center being nothing more than a constant spray of blood. Ramsay watched as Ed and Davos with their horses began flaking into Thorne's lines. Ramsay looked into Small Umber. "Reinforce them. End this fight." "As you wish." Umber stepped out ahead of the force of 700 men. They began to march towards the battle. As they grew closer, their speed began to hasten. Ramsay began to grow a sinking feeling in his stomach as he watched on. Bolton banners began to drop from Lord Umber's men, and suddenly a host of others emerged from his force. There was the bear of House Mormont, the glove of House Glover, the trident of House Manderley, the white star of the Karstarks. Many more also sprouted up. Hornwood, Umber, Kerwin, Reed, and Dustin. It was an army of loyalists. Loyalists of Robb Stark. An army of Northerners. An army of the North. And the North remembers. Umber and his army smashed into the unsuspecting rear of Thorne and Ramsay's army. What was shifting into a formational battle suddenly shifted into a massacre as all heard the chant, "The North remembers." "Shoot them!" Ramsay cried out for one of his commanders to inform him they had used their arrows. "Then send in the rest." With a horn blow and shout from the commander, Ramsay and the remainder of his army marched forth. If he didn't now, then they would surely lose the battle. One of his men then pointed to show him. Ramsay then looked out to see more banners as horses came riding over the hill. It was the sigil of House Aaron. The Vale had come. Ramsay paused, unsure of how to react, yet more anger and dread came over him, as riding past the Knights of the Vale, another host arrived. They are the banners of House Frey and Tully. Edmure himself rode up next to Lords Royce, Thoros, and the Hound. They each drew their swords, and with a shout they descended upon from the hills towards Ramsay. They began to split into two different triangle formations, one to reinforce and end the main battle, with the other made their way to Ramsay himself. Ramsay quickly began to ride back towards Winterfell, shouting at his men to retreat back to the castle. Over 1,000 attempted to run back to the castle, but with their backs turned and not braced into the formation, the Knights of the Vale ran down much of the lines of men. It was no more difficult for water to wash over the ground. Seeing the end of the battle draw near, Thorne attempted to make a cohesive retreat, but suddenly was met by Tormund, who without hesitation stabbed him in the belly with his sword. Jon looked on without little feeling towards Thorne's death, feeling only some relief in that some justice had been served. Taking his horn he had in hand, Jon gave one last blow. Across the field, Ygritte was giving her final command. She and her host came over the hills, and with them the mighty giant won. Ramsay dismounted, telling his men to prepare for a siege. They had lost the battle. Yet when the soldier questioned him, he attempted to reassure him that they still had Winterfell. They could hold out until aid came. But the words did little to ease the Bolton men, as loud bangs of pounding came from the main gate. Screams and steel echoed on the other side. Archers attempted to open fire, but Ramsay watched as his men were picked off by returning fire. Ramsay's eyes widened as the massive doors of the gate were ripped open. Dozens of wildlings and Northmen flooded in. Another skirmish had begun, but with an opening charge of veiled knights bursting in, the Bolton men were unable to form a solid line. Jon himself entered, carrying his sword Longclaw in one hand and a Karstark shield in the other. Lord Umber stood next to Jon, and the two gave one another a smile before Small Umber turned to join the fray. Only, as he did, an arrow pierced his skull, dropping him dead. Jon turned to Ramsay, who was in the middle for preparing another arrow. Jon, enraged, lunged for Ramsay, shield raised, and he blocked two arrows. As Ramsay prepares a third shot, he is suddenly rocked back by a piercing arrow. Ygritte had come, and seeing her man shot at, returned fire. Ramsay drops his bow, inspecting his chest, only for Jon to now be upon him. Jon knocks Ramsay down with his shield before standing above him. Without hesitation, Jon brings down his sword upon Ramsay's head. Seeing their lord killed, those left of the Bolton men surrendered. The battle was over, and they had won. Jon stepped outside the castle walls with Ygritte. They were followed closely by Tormund as they regrouped with Davos and Ed. Coming over to meet with them was Lords Royce, Edmure, Thoros, and the Hound. They exchanged thanks and greetings to one another as a rider arrived with a message. The Battle of Ice had been won, but Stannis Baratheon had fallen in battle. Davos was stricken the hardest with this message. When Jon asked who now ruled, the messenger responded, "The king in the north." Robb Stark now marches back to Winterfell.
Robb peered out over the wall, gazing out at the open fields. It had been almost 2 years since he had stepped foot in his home and watched the people he had grown up with tend to their homes and fields. The air had grown colder the past few months, with some days of snowfall in between. Jane stepped up to him, her belly visibly large from the pregnancy. Robb took the hand of his love, and they spoke of the stable peace the North now had, but warned her that the peace is fleeting. The North had the Vale and Riverlands as part of their kingdom, but King Tommen and the Faith still had the Reach in the Westerlands. Much of their armies were intact, and their eyes looked to the north. Jane would see his worry and comfort him, telling him whatever would come, they would face it together as a family. Robb would smile, thinking of how many of his siblings were now returned, yet none still knew of where Bran had gone. No one had seen him since his disappearance, and according to the Boltons, he had gone north of the Wall. None from the remainder of the Night's Watch had seen him since. Seeing a carriage come over the road, Robb smiled. Stepping out from the convoy was Rickon, Melisandre, and Prince Shireen. Robb embraced his brother, while Davos hugged the princess. Robb, ecstatic, brought Rickon to meet his wife and new sister-in-law. Davos gave his condolences to both Shireen and Melisandre for Stannis and her mother, who also fell ill with a deadly cold while in Eastwatch. Coming out to see Rickon first was Arya, who by now was becoming a young woman. Next was Sansa, and lastly Jon. 5 of the 6 Stark children, all united. What was even more delightful was the arrival of Rickon's direwolf Shaggy Dog. Grey Wind, Ghost, and Shaggy Dog all sniffed one another in recognition, staying with one another as if a small pack was now formed. Robb would then ask Davos and Sansa if all things had been taken care of and if all of the lords had gathered. Sansa would respond that they had all gathered in the Great Hall. Roughly half an hour would pass, and the Great Hall would be full of sound and greetings. Roughly every lord of the North was in attendance, as well as representatives of the Vale and Riverlands. One of the tables had a number of wildlings as well. Sitting with them was Jon and his companions Ygritte, Tormund, Sam, Gilly, Ed, and the now walking on crutches Grin. At another table sat the Hound, Thoros, Davos, Shireen, Melisandre, the now recruited and saved Gendry, and lastly the newly knighted Podrick. The center table had lords Lyanna Mormont, Manderly, Kerwin, and Glover with their personal guard, Great John Umber and his son, and lastly Lady Alice Karstark. The final table had Littlefinger, the Lord Apparent of the Vale, young Lord Aaron, and Lord Warys, with the front of the table being Ed Miratoli and his wife Rosalind. At the head of the room, sitting on a large table where there are a number of seats, on the right end sat Arya and Sansa, on the left end sat Rickon in an open chair, and the center Jane with an open seat for Robb. The great doors into the room opened, and with a hefty walk came in Robb, sword at his side, wearing brown gambeson tunic and a silver crown upon his head. Walking with him was Grey Wind. "The King of the North!" one of the lords shouted, with many clapping and chanting while banging cups on their tables. Robb would pause and then walk over to Jon, pointing to him the open chair. Jon would question him, feeling as if he didn't deserve it, but Robb would tell him that he was a Stark and his brother. The two would then sit in their chairs, commencing their meeting. Much talk would be had about the winter now upon them. Lords would speak of their food levels and storage as well as current manpower. One would then question the wildlings and their reason for being here. Jon would point out how it was the wildlings that fought Ramsay for them. Robb would then also tell them that Stannis promised them lands in the north and that he would honor that pledge. Robb would then see now was the time to speak to the other lords and tell them about the news of the world around them. During their war for the north, King Tommen had died, and Cersei Lannister had claimed the crown. The Lannisters now had the Crownlands, the Westerlands, and the Iron Islands, who new Lord Euron Greyjoy, bent the knee to. As for the Reach, they are in open rebellion against Cersei after the death of Queen Marjorie. However, House Tarly had declared themselves for the crown instead. Robb would inform them that the Stormlands had fallen under the crown's rule after Stannis brought his army north. Lastly, Robb would then inform them all of the most troubling news. Daenerys Targaryen had arrived at Dragonstone with her dragons as well as her army of Unsullied and Dothraki. He would mention to them that Dorne means to ally themselves with Daenerys, as well as the Tyrells of Reach. While many worry what would become of them, now Robb would get their attention as he slammed his hand on the table. He would remind them of their war with the Lannisters and how they bested them time and time again on the field of battle. He would remind them of their Pyrrhic victory over the Freys at the Red Wedding, and how even after that, they lived on and continued to fight. He would remind Jon companions of their survival at Castle Black and the Fist of the First Men, and then how the wildlings and the Northmen fought together with the Knights of the Vale and won the Battle of Winter. How the late Stannis, who was the one true heir and king of the Iron Throne, fought from Blackwater to the Wall. How he and his bannermen, who now sat with him today, won the Battle of Ice against Roose Bolton, the betrayer, dying in battle, but in death won them their victory and freed the North. That sort of sacrifice and debt will be paid in full. With the Night's Watch virtually gone, having fought under Thorne in the Battle of Bastards, Robb would name Tormund a Northern Lord. He would give him Castle Black for his family and the clan. He would also be named Warden of the Wall. The other 11 castles along the wall were to be given to the rest of the Wildling clan leaders, each of whom would swear fealty to Tormund or to the Northern Crown. They would be given the lands of the gift to farm and tend to as well. Many of the Northern Lords were stunned by this, but those from the Vale and Riverlands, and even the Baratheons, saw this as fair. Robb would then declare that Gendry would be legalized as a true Baratheon, and that after seeing combat and fighting for the North, he and Podrick would be fully anointed knights. Grin, former brother of Night's Watch, for his bravery at Castle Black, would be given the name Grin the Iron Gate. He and Ed would also be knighted. Next, Robb would inform them that the Dread Fort would be cleared and emptied of all Bolton belongings, and they would be burned. The castle would be given to Jon to take as his own as a new Lord of the North. The North was stable, but now there were new matters and threats to attend to. Edmure returned to the Twins with his host, along with Gendry and the Baratheon army. They were to hold the Riverlands until his arrival. Lord Royce would take a third of the Vale army and head south with them, while the rest were to head back to the Vale, including Littlefinger. Sansa, Arya, Princess Shireen, and Rickon would stay here in Winterfell with Queen Jane. As for the Northern Lords and Wildlings, they had already given so much and needed time to recover, so they were all to stay and rebuild. As for he and Jon, they would establish their own personal retinue, and they would rejoin the other lords south to secure their lands and freedom, if need be, meet with the so-called dragon. Robb would then make one last promise. All were silent as he rose. 300 years ago, my ancestors bent the knee to the Targaryens, and after 300 years of service, they repaid that trust and loyalty with fire and blood. My father fought for the realm's freedom against the Mad King and the Targaryens after they kidnapped my aunt and killed my uncle and grandfather. We fought for northern independence after the Lannisters usurped the throne from its rightful rulers and killed my father. He fought for survival from the Boltons, and after they killed my mother, killed our friends and family members, we fought, and we won. I swear to you, my lords, here and now, on my honor and on my life, on my family's life, I will not bend the knee. We shall live free. Lord Umber was the first to stand, drawing his sword. I said it before, there be only one king I mean to serve, the King of the North. All the other lords rose, drawing their swords, from Tully to Arryn, Wildling and Northman, Baratheon and Stark all rose. The King of the North! The King of the North! The King of the North! And that is where our story will end, for now.
There once was a man who'd spend his nights all alone, walking along the shore. He'd cast a rain upon the waves, in hopes that perhaps he could tame the tides one day.